Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, which covers Volume 1 of Kroll's Global Fraud and Risk Report 2021 survey, focused on bribery and corruption risks, somewhat poetically subtitled The Winds of Change. And thank you to our colleagues at Legal 500 for providing this platform for us to present to you today. My name is Rich Plansky, and I'm the Regional Managing Director for North America at Kroll's Forensic Investigations and Intelligence Practice. Next slide, please. I am privileged to be joined today by some of my esteemed colleagues and friends. Let's start with the Londoners. So Zoe Newman is a Managing Director in Kroll's Forensic Investigations and Intelligence Practice, or FII. She also co-heads the Global Financial Investigations Practice. Zoe has over 20 years of experience leading international cross-border investigations, including many involving the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and other local bribery laws. Her casework has taken her to Eastern Europe, the Middle East, China, Brazil, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and she has presented her findings to the US SEC and the Department of Justice, among other regulators. Howard Cooper, another Londoner, is also a Managing Director in the FII practice, and along with Zoe, the co-head of our global FI practice. Howard has extensive experience investigating, detecting, preventing, and recovering the proceeds of fraud, money laundering, and corruption. He specializes in working with large, complex data sets and using analytics to identify wrongdoing, to trace funds, identify assets, and support recovery actions. My colleague Raz Golpovar is a Senior Director in Kroll's Data Insights and Forensics Practice. Raz has more than 20 years of compliance and investigations experience. He specializes in the application of relevant data analytics and software tools to solve client problems in compliance, investigations, and litigation support matters. He has extensive experience applying data analytic techniques on both structured and unstructured data sets to detect, investigate, and prevent instances of fraud, bribery, corruption, and other misconduct. We are also happy to welcome to the panel Nargiz Burke-Peterson. She is the Vice President, Regional General Counsel for Growth and Emerging Markets at the pharmaceutical giant Takeda. She's a multilingual US qualified international corporate law attorney with in-house and law firm experience in the US, Europe, CIS, and the Middle East. Quite a panel we have for you today. So with these introductions out of the way, let's get down to business. So to begin with, our survey covered a broad group of over 1,300 respondents consisting of general counsels, chief compliance officers, chief financial officers, and CEOs from companies drawn from 17 countries and regions throughout the world. And the headline findings are as follows. There is some seemingly good news here, and as an optimist, I always like to start with the good news. So let's begin with the fact that our respondents are doing enterprise-wide risk assessments, 82% of them to be exact. And 86% of them are employing data analytics technology to proactively detect risk. And their boards are all over this. 72%, according to our respondents, of their boards are giving bribery and corruption risk sufficient attention. And last but not least, 74% of our respondents believe that their organization's ABC controls are effective at preventing and detecting high-risk activity. But, and there is a very big but here, but the vast majority of our respondents, 82%, reported that their organizations had been significantly impacted by corruption and other illicit activity. So in other words, our respondents simultaneously think that they are doing a great job at preventing and detecting bribery and corruption and fraud, and at the same time, they believe they're getting killed by bribery, corruption, and fraud. Our respondents also gave us some insight into what keeps them up at night when it comes to bribery and corruption. First and foremost, no surprise here, it's third parties, specifically the lack of visibility into suppliers, customers, and distributors. In second place is weak internal record keeping. and the bronze medal goes to our respondents' own employees. Okay, so there is a lot to digest there. Some of it somewhat confusing. And so in an effort to cut through all of the noise and get down to the heart of the matter, let's start with my friend and colleague, Howard Cooper. So Howard, you're up first. Are you surprised, pleasantly or otherwise, that 82% of our respondents had undertaken an enterprise-wide risk assessment?
Thanks, Rich. It's a high percentage and it's a positive response. I guess the follow-up question is, were those risk assessments effective? The survey responses suggest that the answer to that question might be no. In my experience, many organizations struggle to undertake a truly effective enterprise-wide risk assessment because it's an ever-moving target. It might take months to prepare, and often they rely on historic information. So by the time it's prepared, the business has moved on. And given the impact of the global events over the past 18 months and the changes this has imposed on business, this makes undertaking an effective EWRA all the more challenging. So I guess in summary, perhaps given the current conditions, the focus should instead be on monitoring change. Most of the investigation work that Kroll is involved in, when you follow the underlying issue back to source, you identify that something's changed. Is it the acquisition of a new business, moving into a new market, taking on a new customer or supplier, hiring a new employee, developing a new product? If you're a bank, issuing a new set of loans. All these events are things that a business can monitor and can control. I think what's changed in the last 18 months is that the global pandemic has thrown up a number of unforeseen changes, such as home working, travel restrictions, supply chain pressures, things that you can't necessarily control the underlying cause. But again, the resultant changes are something that can be identified and the associated risks monitored. So then it's a case of how do you do that? It comes down to effective communication, information sharing within the business to get the right information to the right people at the right time. And an essential part, I guess, Rich, of that change monitoring, for want of a better phrase, is the ability to access reliable data internally and centrally.
So thank you for that, Howard. Let's get some free advice here. Obviously, where there is, I think your headline is where there is change, there is risk. And the last year and a half has been, if nothing else, fraught with risk. In our not post-pandemic, current pandemic world, what sort of practical advice do you have for our listeners on how to do an effective enterprise risk assessment in a world that's largely remote?
I think you've got to, as I said, you've got to identify the areas in the business that have changed, and you've got to go reach out to the business and to ask, so what have you seen that's changed? Then you've got to identify the sources of information that you can use to monitor the impact of those changes. So you've got change and, as you said, the resultant risk that's associated with that. Once you've identified the information sources, then you can start to monitor the impact on an ongoing basis. And it needs to be on an ongoing basis. It cannot be, to be effective, it cannot be relying on information that's 3-6 months old.
Right, because risk is not a static concept. It changes every day. Thank you for that, Howard. Let's turn to our friend Ross, who, as we all know, is a lover of all things data. So Ross, I'm guessing correct me if I'm wrong, that you are encouraged that 86% of our respondents say they are using data analytics in a proactive way to detect high-risk behavior. Are you encouraged by that? A sub-question, are you equally discouraged by the fact that essentially the same percentage feel like they're getting killed by bribery, corruption, and other illicit behavior? What's your take on this?
Well, I have to say, when I saw those figures, I was surprised, especially by the first one of the high volume of people using data analytics in a proactive way to detect bribery and corruption. But I think we have to, when we see the results, as you put it, by being killed by the same issues, I think we have to take it in two ways. One is it clearly demonstrates there's a recognition for using data analytics. There's definitely there's a mode of change. If we did that survey a few years ago, I think that percentage would definitely be lower. So I'm certainly encouraged by the fact that it's demonstrating that recognition for using data analytics in this space. And we see that, I think, as you get into the granular details of the survey responses, you see that across all industries and across all geographies. So a very, very positive message. And I think one that I'd add to that, when we look at global regulatory agencies, we've been hearing that they're doing exactly the same thing over the past few years, that they're using more data and analytics for fighting, finding risks, whether it's bribery and corruption or other. And there's certainly been a lot of encouragement from government agencies for corporates to do the same. So I'm very encouraged and positive by that. I think when we come to the second statistic that you highlighted, it does unfortunately point to, well, how effective is this proactive data analytics that is being deployed, and is it aligned to the risks? Because clearly it seems like it isn't. There are certain risks that people are trying to use data analytics to kind of prevent or find, and the result is it's not really working.
So why not? Why do you think it's not more effective, Roz? Data analytics is supposed to be, you buy a software license, you turn it on, and all of the fraud, bribery, and corruption goes away, right? Isn't that how data analytics works?
I wish, perhaps for some, but not in this case. I think, look, my view is, data analytics requires a lot of planning, and it requires that planning really needs to come back to the big three elements of almost anything, which is people, process, technology. And if you allow me just to try and describe those into this area, really around, when it comes to data analytics, you really, I've seen it too often. I'm sure the panel has. It's being used in the investigative space, compliance space, too much as in a piecemeal fashion. It's kind of like a specific thing that, a specific investigation, specific issue. Let's just focus on that. Let's get the job done. What data do we need? And if that, and applying some analytics, and that's it. Let's close the book. And really, for it to become effective, especially for looking at bribery and corruption risks, you need that wider planning of saying, well, let's try to build something for the longer vision, having that strategy, and really coming and saying, well, what are the risks that we're trying to measure? Whether it's a one-off investigation, or whether it's building a compliance monitoring solution, anything like that. What are the risks? Where is the data? And that requires quite a bit of work. You have to think about, where is the data? Is that data within my organization? Does it exist on my systems? And that comes with a whole myriad of problems of different large volumes of data, different variety of data, and difficulties of access to that data and the quality of that data, let alone thinking about external data sources, such as corporate registries and many, many more, social media data, etc., and so on, which then you can bring together and actually start really enriching your data and really trying to build something that puts you in the best position to be effective with that data analytics. So that, I guess I'm talking a lot around that process environment of getting familiar with the data landscape, using internal, external data sets. But then I think you mentioned tool, the word tool and a software license, and that's often a key pitfall for what I've seen, is that organizations are seeing a tool that they think will solve their problems, and sometimes it does. We all use different software and tools to do the things that we need, but often the tool, whilst on the label it's going to solve all your problems, by the time you get to the data that you've got, which doesn't really fit the tool, and you have to get the data ready. So there's a lot of data engineering that's required for the tool to work. It's sometimes, by the time you feed the data through to the technology or the tool, it's not doing what it said on the tin, because you haven't given it the right set of data, or you haven't deployed it in the right way. So I think that's a big misconception that I'll buy this tool and it's going to fix all my problems. It still requires quite a bit of effort. And the last bit I'll bring to that is the people that you need involved. You do definitely, you don't just need the data analytics people. You don't need the people who know the process, who understand the data, who have the right skills, whether those are internal or external people who can come in and support an organization setting up an analytics capability. You do need that skill set, but probably more importantly, you need key stakeholders within the organization to help you understand those risks. The people in the business, or the parts of the business that you're trying to measure those risks for. You need stakeholders like IT who will give you access to the systems and the data. I mentioned IT. A lot of corporates I've seen use their IT department to do the data analytics, and that's not really their job. That's not what they're, and sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. So stakeholders are really key, and it doesn't always have to be business and IT. You need compliance, maybe internal audit, etc. It does really come back to what I was saying about that vision and strategy that you're trying to build. So I think those are some of the reasons that probably prevent it being so effective.
And I think sorry, Rich, just to supplement what Raz said, what Howard and I see when we're called in to investigate or go and assist with a preventative exercise, a lot of the main issues are as to just really attest to what Raz said. People describe data analytics, and data analytics means very different things to different people. But in a lot of our investigations, when we're reporting, one of the key comments is, oh my God, this was so obvious in terms of the accounting records, if anyone had looked. But the problem is no one had, and that's because people are using it to investigate as opposed to monitor and pick up red flags and check them. And again, just to sort of reaffirm Raz's point, we will see a big corporate try and apply the same test to all of its regions of high risk activity, as opposed to attuning them to the different service lines, the different regions, the cultural nuances of how invoices are raised, businesses transacted in those regions. So it's really the specific tailoring of the risks and how they are then translated to the data analytics.
So great points, both Zoe and Raz. And if I can unpack some of them and maybe dig a little deeper. So I think, Zoe, your point is that data analytics is somewhat of a Rorschach test in that it means different things to different people. And Raz, I think your point, very well made, was that it's not just the technology, it's the people, the process, and the technology, all equally important. And all closely connected to Howard's point, in that if you don't start with a robust and detailed risk assessment, then all of these other things are generally useless because they're not looking at the right risks. Okay, let's move away from Raz for a second. So Zoe and Nargis, I have a brain teaser for you. So if 74% of our respondents think they're doing a great job of preventing and detecting bribery, corruption, and illicit behavior, and yet the vast majority of these same people report that they're still getting badly impacted by the very behavior they're trying to prevent and detect. How do those two thoughts live in the same human brain? Back in college psychology courses, we used to call this cognitive dissonance. They are opposites, but for our respondents, who are all accomplished, high-level decision makers at major corporates across the world seem to be able to contain both of those thoughts in their heads. What's the disconnect here? Nargis, let's start with you from an in-house perspective. What's going on here?
Yeah, I don't know, but let me guess. I think in your slides, and also certainly for our organization, where we see the biggest risk is around third parties and their compliance. And I'm afraid that a lot of that is difficult to be picked up through data analytics, because data analytics is usually internally focused. Some of it, for example, in terms of, if you have employees interacting with third parties and those employees doing something that they're not supposed to do, for example, spending too much on a meal with healthcare professional. I'm in pharma, so that's relevant. That can be picked up. If a distributor spends too much money in a discussion with this healthcare professional, that is not going to be picked up through your internal data analysis, right? That will have to be picked up through other things, such as due diligence that you do, such as audit procedures that you have in place, and you engage with third parties. So I'm guessing that a lot of those issues come through interactions with third parties that are a little bit more difficult to control.
What are your thoughts, Zoe?
I think Nargis is absolutely right. I guess there's a few other observations, because the third parties are the known unknown, and that is ever more emphasized because of globalization. There's barely an organization that doesn't rely on an international network of subsidiaries, customers, or third parties that's around here. So despite the corporate head office mantra, there's always a divide between senior management and the reality of local business, and I think corporates realize that. I don't think it was a coincidence that the largest firms that we surveyed reported a very significant impact, as they're the most difficult to control and have just a view on a horizontal level as to what's going on within those organizations. I also think, although most corporates try to do the right thing in terms of prevention and detection of bribery, we all know it still goes on. I think one of the more recent estimates put the global value of bribery as high as $1.7 trillion. So the point being, you just need to find someone who is going to pay a bribe and someone willing to accept it. So we all know it's going on around us, and corporates are trying to prevent it, yet it's still happening anyway. And that someone willing to pay might be an employee of your organization, might be an affiliate of your organization, et cetera, et cetera. So organizations have to do everything they can to educate them of the reason why they shouldn't pay bribes, why corruption is bad, put in place the strongest controls they can, and going back to the earlier points, try and monitor what's happening to stop it in its tracks should the worst occur and the system fail. And I guess finally, there's the COVID element that we all hate bringing it back to COVID, but the supply chains have changed immeasurably. So the third party risk is heightened even more, added to the fact it's not been possible to get out in the field, to investigate, to do audits, to speak to your people. There'll be many employees that have joined organizations that have never physically met any of their colleagues and aren't therefore embedded in the culture of those organizations. And of course, I guess finally, there's the financial pressures at a basic level have led to will have led to the scrapping or delay of a lot of internal spending on prevention and back office, as it's called, unfortunately, in terms of some of those support functions that are really the preventative aspect depends upon.
So Zoe, in our pandemic world, are you seeing any changes in your own casework in terms of the root causes of bribery and corruption due to some of the factors that you just mentioned?
A very good question. The root cause for us, and Howard will smile, the root cause, because we've been saying it for years, but it's time and time again, it's the same root cause, and that is a foreign subsidiary in a far off flung location is where sort of the issue arises, and it's probably been acquired. It's probably not been integrated properly. There's maybe former owner management left in place. Therefore, all of the culture around that subsidiary operation is retained around that former owner manager. And yet at headquarters level, they've got the glossiest compliance system. They've got SAP everywhere. Yet there's this outlier location that's still reporting up to group via a spreadsheet because its systems haven't been integrated. But who sat on a board would realise that, because it's a small piece of a massive pie.
Okay, I'll add another one, if I may, Rich. That I think we would see there's a lot more money washing around at the moment that is a result of COVID that is susceptible to corruption. So the funding that has gone in at a country level, I mean, to a country, and the funding that has been individually within countries to support the kickstart of the economy, a lot of that is susceptible to illicit fund flows, and being used in infrastructure projects, being used in construction, and then has to work its way through the system. So if you are providing financial services, you need to be on the lookout for it as well. So I think in the bigger picture, what is sort of feeding corruption, the emergency funding packages are something that need to be on the lookout for.
So it almost sounds like the perfect storm, as the two of you describe it, where you have a lot of financial pain due to the pandemic. You have lots of money sloshing around with perhaps not the best controls. And you have remote working maybe sort of wearing away at some of the connectivity and the cultural controls that are in place to prevent folks from engaging in this sort of behavior. And I would add to that some changed enforcement priorities, certainly in the United States, where the relatively new federal government has made it very clear that bribery and corruption are, if not at the top of the list, then pretty close. A lot of stuff in the soup at the moment. So Nargis, I wanted to ask you about the finding which I found interesting, that a very significant portion of our respondents feel that their boards are giving bribery and corruption concerns the appropriate level of attention. Is that your experience as well? And also, just from your travels, is it real attention, or is it more of a box checking exercise on the part of the board?
Well, in my experience, it is real attention. And I don't sit on the board, so I wouldn't have firsthand experience, but certainly from what I hear from the CEO and the very top management in the company, these people realize what's at stake. And I would say that in the current company and other multinationals where I worked at, you can survive if you haven't delivered sales for a year or two, right? You can survive and still keep your job. You, in the current environment, cannot survive in your job if there is a significant compliance issue in your area. And it doesn't have to be something that you have actively participated in. Lack of knowledge or awareness of what's happening in your area would be enough for someone to lose their job. So I think there is quite a strong message from the top. I think that what's also important is that it's not just a message from the top, but there are appropriate actions around it, such as that you dedicate appropriate resources in your organization for that message to be implementable. And I see that, I think some companies are, especially those that are traded internationally, public companies are very, very sensitive to that and indeed take the appropriate action. And, there are some smaller players that perhaps are not yet quite as sensitive, but I think that there is globally a bigger appreciation for the risks associated with bribery and corruption. And that's a very, very good sign.
So let's get great points, Nargis. Let's get more specific here. So pushing down that message, that tone at the top, making it real, walking the walk instead of just talking the talk, requires specific action. Can you give us some examples of some strategies and actions that you have found to be effective in accomplishing that goal?
Sure. I mean, so direct communication, one, right? Messages, messages like really actual, physical communication in terms of the CEO saying something, or the message that is sent out in an organization, giving light to the programs that are running, compliance programs, for example. We've had a big campaign around Speak Up, for example, because we feel that it is incredibly important tool for being able to detect any sort of non-compliance if the employees feel comfortable speaking up. And that was something that was championed not just by our chief compliance officer, but also by our CEO, and then trickled down to regional heads of business and locally. In addition to that, ensuring that you have a proper compliance program in place with all of the elements that have been discussed already, monitoring, Rasul was talking about that. Data monitoring is an important part of it. In our organization, it's the monitoring piece is very important. Data monitoring is complex, and it's, in some jurisdictions it's possible to do it. In others, we have challenges. But certainly where we have implemented it, we have seen that, what we call the smart monitoring. So instead of pulling out samples just kind of randomly, we have, the data analytics happens, and, artificial intelligence basically flags a sample to us, then physically people look at, compliance professionals look at for any sort of issues. And that's being rolled out now slowly throughout the company. So these types of elements, ensuring that you have a full compliance program with monitoring, with messaging, with the employees being able to speak up and having the instrument, the tools to raise their concerns, all of that is very important and have been used successfully, I think, in my current company and the previous companies I worked at.
Excellent.
One client of ours, Rich, I thought was really impressive in terms of the company actually going beyond just the tone from the top and corporate messaging. Was they were rolling out a new compliance program that was quite different and required some quite strong cultural adjustment around the organization. And they actually got the head of sales to go around all of the regions and locations and deliver the compliance message about why it was important and address sort of the typical questions that are raised from the business on the ground who's trying to win work. And I think that was a really important message, that corporate was taking it seriously, and also corporate understood some of the issues that were faced, and they wanted to sort of relay their stance on the issues that folk on the ground come up with, so that the head of sales could say, no, if you are given a choice between a contract with a bribe being paid or no contract, you take the no contract.
Great. Let's pause for just a second for a tiny bit of housekeeping as we're getting pretty far along into our presentation here. For anyone who's listening who has questions, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get to those questions at the end of the hour. So with that out of the way, let's geek out a little bit with Roz. So Nargis was talking a bit about monitoring and about another one of these Rorschach terms, artificial intelligence, which means all things to all people. So what Nargis was describing at her organization was really interesting, in that the I in AI came from the people who knew what they were looking for. Can you talk about that specifically? I know perhaps some folks are worried that in the age of machines and robots that they're going to replace compliance professionals. Can you give us any comfort about that, and perhaps give us some advice on how you merge those two things, the knowledge in our best professionals' heads and the technology that helps leverage that knowledge across huge data sets?
That's a fantastic question. And well, look, I don't think, and yes, there's a need, a way of thinking that machines, computers are going to replace humans, whether it's in the compliance world or other areas of work. I'm a firm believer that actually the human intelligence, the human element, I talked about people, process, technology, and I talked about the people and the intelligence that the people have. It's really around, we have, the compliance subject matter experts. They know, they understand where these risks are. They understand how to look for those risks. They just might not be equipped with the right tools, i.e. things like monitoring capabilities, certain technologies, processes, data analytics, to do that in a more amplified way. And I'm going to use that word amplified another time, because what I think data analytics gives you is the opportunity to use those subject matter expertise, that the human intelligence, and actually amplify that across the organization, where individuals are currently doing it on a one-to-one basis, maybe working in teams. But if you can, incorporate that intelligence and ask the computer to say, right, these are the patterns that we know are the indicators for bribery, corruption, or whatever risk that you're trying to measure. Can we now extrapolate that across all of our data landscape? Can we extrapolate that and maybe tailor it for certain regions? Zoe was, talking about earlier about certain regions that might be further outreach and their data might be different. Well, we know some of the risks that we're looking for. We just need to customize those for those particular markets, for those particular risks. But it's really, again, coming back to that human intelligence and getting the computer to learn that and extrapolate it. So for me, that word amplification resonates really well in how you bring humans and computers together. And I think the last bit I'll leave with is that then provides more time for humans to do what they're really good at, to spend time in the markets, to do the work that they need to do the investigations. You can get the machine to find you the risky red flags, whatever you're looking for, but then humans can interpret that with their intelligence. And the very last point I'll leave is the feedback loop is so important. So often we do investigations, so often we go down a lead and investigate and close the matter. But it's that human intelligence at the end is that we have to feed back into the monitoring process and allow the data analytics models, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, etc., all these techniques that we talk about, let them learn from the findings so that they're better equipped at finding the risks. Does that answer your question? I think hopefully I brought it all together.
It does, and I'm very relieved to know that we will not be replaced by machines, at least not right now. That's very comforting, Ross.
You're recording this, aren't we? So I think we should ask that question to Raz in 20 years' time.
If I'm still around.
If I may add to that, I also somewhat self-servingly don't think that either lawyers or compliance people will be replaced anytime soon by artificial intelligence. And just to bring an example, which I talked to a colleague today, just preparing for this webinar, which I thought was interesting. So the compliance team does the smart monitoring where they pull out samples and look at them and see what's going on. But in addition to that, the data, the full data, is given to general managers to see, because it's only general managers that will know certain. For example, they will be able to detect if one of the sales reps is having an unusually high amount of meetings with a specific HCPs. Only a general manager would be able to detect that something is happening on a holiday, for example. So there are things, or that, suddenly the productivity of a particular salesperson who hasn't been very productive for most of his careers as they go through the roof, right? So the certain things that our compliance colleagues might not see, but the business colleagues might see it. So in addition to the piece where the compliance goes through it, there's this additional set of review that helps in not just in compliance in terms of detecting bribery and corruption, but also just in a general business sense, right? But they work together hand in hand.
That is an excellent and comforting point, and I think that in my own experience, I've seen that is the foundation for a successful technology strategy for the prevention of things like bribery and corruption, because that's really hard-won knowledge. I'm sure that some of the folks that you're talking about, Nargiz, have been doing this for decades and have a really keen eye for when something is wrong. They know when they have a good idea of what baseline behavior is, and they can see departures from that baseline. And if that hard-won valuable intelligence can be used to inform analytics technology for the I in AI, then you can really have something quite powerful. It's that link between the human and the machine. So Roz, let's geek out a little bit more. Since I'm the master of ceremonies, I get to decide that let's geek out a little bit more. So one of the things that Nargiz was talking about is anomalies, right? That we all know this from anyone who's been involved in investigations, fraud, bribery, corruption, any sort of illicit behavior, knows that that sort of behavior changes over time. Today's fraud looks different from fraud 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And 5 years from now, it will look different in terms of the methodologies, the techniques, etc. But one thing in my experience that doesn't change is that when people are planning to do something wrong, when they're in the middle of executing some sort of fraud, and when they're trying to cover it up, their behavior often changes in ways that can be measured. So is that anomaly detection, finding the sorts of changes in behavior that can be consistent with illicit behavior, in your view, is that part of an overall analytics strategy for prevention of bribery, corruption, and fraud?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And Nargiz mentioned some examples there that I'll use it in exactly the same way. We, in previous projects that I've worked on, trying to build compliance monitoring capability, which is data analytics led, a lot of our focus was around the behavior of the employees and really looking at specific teams in certain regions, certain departments, and comparing their behavior across peers. So you could see, let's say, a sales representatives, how often they would meet any healthcare professional. I'll use Nargiz as example. And you would see that maybe, the relationship might be 3-4 times meetings a year. But this one individual, which is behaving exactly the same as the other sales reps, except he's meeting one healthcare professional 60 times a year. Oh, okay, that's already one indicator. Can we see anything else? Oh, we see their kind of behavior for their expense claims. Everybody is claiming, $60, $100, whatever might be for taking a client out. This person's behavior is quite different. They're taking the same doctor out quite often. And then if you can then start correlating that with other information around the individuals that might be involved and their behavior, are we seeing the same healthcare professional now representing the organization in a way that's promoting our products, in a way that we've, like talking or promoting, let's use the healthcare example, promoting the drugs that are provided by the organization. We're starting to triangulate and connect the dots. So behavior actually is, in my view, we talk about a data analytics maturity journey often, and we talked a little bit today around AI and using statistical methodologies to predict something. But we can come really, really basic and use quite rules-based and say, today we, very basic analytics to look at rules that are applied. Are these invoices duplicate and so on? And there's a big spectrum between the basic analytics and the advanced analytics that you can use. And you do need to go through that journey. And I think that's where the behavioral analytics can come in. But you need to learn the data, get that ready, and then keep remodeling as you talked about, because the risks change, your data changes, your business changes. So this journey that you go on wanting to be, predicting fraud, predicting bribery and risk corruption, you have to go through that journey with data and analytics. But going back to the point around behavior, it's along that journey, and you have to keep changing.
Yeah, the concept of modeling is a powerful one. Human behavior is very complicated, and to Nargis's previous point too, if you can model the behaviors that you're interested in, the ones that are most likely to be problematic, then you can make better, more efficient, more effective use of what we all agree are limited compliance and investigative resources. If you spend most of your time looking at things that are most likely to be problematic, that's a big win for analytics, and it's a big win for an internal compliance function. So we have a lot. Go ahead, Howard.
Sorry, Rick. And right now, a lot
Please.
of those behaviors are subject to change, and so it's being conscious of. So we're seeing an increase in the number of financial misstatement type issues with employees looking to inflate the financial performance of the business to avoid it either coming to the scrutiny of headquarters or for causing the business to get into distress and insolvency, or the bank calling in the loan. So it's monitoring the pressures that are exerted on the individuals in the business, as they're currently, a lot of them are sat at home in their pajamas, working under a very different conditions than they were 18 months ago.
Great. So we have a little over 10 minutes left, and we have a lot of great questions from our attendees. So let's turn to those. This is one for the panel. So whoever's fastest gets to answer it first. The need to carry out in-depth investigations almost inevitably entails processing the personal data of employees, managers, and third parties outside the company. What should be considered to protect this information, third-party risks? Great question. Anyone from the panel care to answer?
Shall I go first?
Please.
I think one of the benefits that you should remember is, most of the time when we're trying to find risks around fraud and bribery, it's actually not personal data that's relevant. It's transactional data to look for anomalies around third-party relationships, and it's looking into third parties themselves and how they might be connected to individuals in their organization, maybe using some internal organizational email. Obviously, in certain jurisdictions, you have to be careful around the use of that, such as Germany, etc. But on the whole, personal data isn't so relevant. It's more about it's more the data that using the data that's available to you internally within the company, and also the data that's out there in the public record to explain or give more context around that internal transactional data.
If I can add to that, sometimes, for example, if you have an investigation that's generally handled from global headquarters somewhere in a lock that's in a different jurisdiction, that might have some rules around what kind of data could go out of the country. You kind of, you have to keep that in mind. I was just going to say that it's important that along with your compliance on bribery and corruption, you should probably also have a strong privacy program in jurisdictions where that's an issue, such as EU or Turkey, Russia, or China. So that it's important that privacy issues are top of mind as well, and that you don't inadvertently violate privacy laws in the country where you're operating.
Okay, we have a number of questions about regulation, and in particular, the expectations of certain regulators. So let me start with a question about whether anyone on this panel knows of regulatory agencies that expect companies to systematically review their unstructured data And if I could interpret, meaning internal communications, emails, chat messages, etc. Is this becoming the norm? Are there regulators who are expecting their regulated companies to be on top of that?
Shall I go again?
You should, Zoe.
I'll try, but come and say.
Have a
go. The answer is, I don't think a regulator would ever be that prescriptive. One of the problems companies have, and it remains the US FCPA, the UK Bribery Act, and the French Sapin-Deux, the usual ones that most corporates are frightened of. But one of the problems that they have is that the guidance is more often than not prescriptive. So, the latest DOJ guidance just says that a compliance program should be subject to ongoing monitoring. Now, some will interpret that as a massive data analytics piece. Others will interpret that as a biannual review. So I don't think there's an expectation that you are monitoring your employees' emails, your unstructured data in any way. Unless you're investigating, when you're expected to have conducted a thorough investigation in that angle. I think the one area where that is becoming more prevalent is in financial services, around going back to Raz and Rich's point, detecting risk around trading activity and monitoring traders' chats and that side of things. But that's, I guess, going into a different topic.
Yeah, let me follow up on that though, Zoe. So excellent point about financial institutions. There is certainly in the US an expectation that regulated financial institutions will monitor structured data, their transactions. That's pretty clear. Do you see a time in which that bleeds over into unstructured? That, there's plenty of risk in transactions, but there's also plenty of risk buried within communications data. Do you get out your crystal ball, Zoe? Do you see that happening in the future?
My personal view, that others may disagree with, is that it would be probably too hot a topic in terms of personal privacy, particularly if you think of the EU and other jurisdictions for the big corporate beast watching individual employees, snooping on them. So my personal view is there's unlikely to be very specific guidance around that, but I may be wrong.
Okay, so lots of questions too about working remotely and the effect that has had, if any, on bribery, corruption, and fraud. In your opinion, panel, is the fact that most people are working remotely and have been for a year and a half making the problem worse, better, or is it not having any sort of discernible impact?
I think
talk about that. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it, Nuggies.
No, I was just going to say, being a pharma company, a lot of our business activities surrounded around actions with HCPs, face-to-face interactions, congresses, dinners, you name it, right? And it was very, very important to our sales colleagues to say that, it's just crucially important that we have this event and we invite these HCPs and we talk to them face-to-face, or that we go and see them face-to-face. And of course, those situations, they are the ones that are conducive to potential bribery and corruption issues. This environment showed that, we cannot have these face-to-face events. We cannot have these face-to-face interactions, and we can still have a business. So I think that the organization is learning from that actually the number of these face-to-face interactions that are needed for business are not quite as many as, our colleagues sometimes would like us to believe, right? So, and reducing the number of these interactions, of course, reduces risk. So,
if I could quickly add around the pandemic, we've talked about the impact of the pandemic on bribery and corruption, and if I can add a positive note on it, one of the things that we've seen the pandemic has caused is that a lot of organizations' data has now become digitized. And that has turned the world around, because it actually gives organizations the opportunity to now look at data that they would never have looked at before, because it could have been manual or it could have been paper or based, etc. So I think one thing that the pandemic has brought in is the opportunity for monitoring capability. And I come back to my area of data and analytics. It's really given that opportunity for organizations who want to enhance their capability, their monitoring capability, and actually use much more of their data for these types of initiatives.
I think I would just pick up on the different sets of opportunities that the pandemic presents, and with home working and the theft of intellectual property, the account financial misstatement issues that I talked about before, fake email frauds, which is not a corruption issue, but people, I think the mindset, if you're sat at home as opposed to in the office, it changes your mindset, so you are more susceptible to some of the things that you wouldn't have been susceptible to if you were working under that environment where you have to enter the building with your swipe card and you're wearing a suit. And so I do think there are a whole suite of risks that come with the home working.
Great. Okay, we have come to our last question, and this is the hardest question, and all of you must make an effort to answer this question. So Zoe, you're going to have to lend your crystal ball to your fellow panelists, because the question is, next year, when we do this panel again, what are we going to be talking about? Howard, let's lead off with you.
We are going to be talking about, continue that conversation about how the problem with corrupt fund flows and the controls that you need to have in place, the responsibility of corporates to take more responsibility for stopping illicit fund flows and money laundering. I think that will be a theme.
Nargiz, your answer.
I just had to unmute that. I think that we will we'll be discussing how wrong we were about us being irreplaceable, and seeing artificial intelligence slowly entering the areas that we thought only we humans can do.
Excellent. Ross, do you agree with that? What's your prediction?
I think we'll see an uptake of people. I think the percentage of using data in a proactive way for bribery and corruption, I think the number will still be high. I want to be optimistic and see that organizations start making more of an effective use of data analytics. So I think I'm hoping that next year we'll be talking about that there is an uptake of using data analytics in a proactive way, and it's becoming more and more effective.
So you are an optimist. Do you think we're going to see less cognitive dissonance in the survey results next year?
I'm hoping so, yeah.
Excellent. And Zoe, last but certainly not least,
it's not fair to go last on this one. I mean, 100% to Howard's point, I think we will start to see next year and on into the following years a lot of corporates caught up in government scandals around government spending that's been issued as a result of COVID. And I think probably fraud will come higher up the agenda than bribery and corruption, because it, again, to the point about financial misstatement and misrepresentation around dealings with third parties, fraud will become much higher up the agenda topic. And hopefully that will result in more analytics.
Right on time. We are at exactly the end of the hour. So with the few seconds we have left, thank you to Legal 500. Thank you to each and every one of our terrific panelists. And most of all, thank you to everyone for joining today. Have a great day.